Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to see you here today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Cliveden Literary Festival. We have a packed panel to talk about 100 years of Zionism and the Balfour Declaration. We will try and keep to time, but let me first of all just introduce our panellists. First of all, Lord Rothschild, Jacob, 4th Baron Rothschild. He's the great-nephew of the man to whom that letter on your seats was addressed, the second Lord Rothschild, Walter Rothschild. Jacob Rothschild is a distinguished public figure in this country, banker, an enormously generous philanthropist in all sorts of areas, the arts, architecture, archaeology, an honorary fellow of the British Academy, and it's very nice and very special to have a representative of the Rothschild family here today to talk about some of that. Simon Sebag Montefiore, descendant of another very distinguished Anglo-Jewish family, a journalist now, a best-selling author, both of fiction and non-fiction, known to you, I'm sure, through television appearances and also through some of his books, which include, I think, recently a book about the Romanovs, and also, of course, a history of Jerusalem, a wonderful, revealing, very readable history, a biography, as he calls it, of a unique city. Howard Jacobson, hot foot from his earlier appearance just in the marquee down the road. In his youth, I think a university teacher, but unlike me, he saw the light, got out, and has written a whole series of very engaging and quirky novels, including one of them winning the Man Booker Prize. Known for his sense of humour and his quirky take on, I suppose, really what it is to be Jewish today in the modern world. And of course, his novella Pussy has caused a great sensation, a satire on the oddities of trumpery today. Now, the last one, I can't remember your name. So, Simon Sharber, an Essex man who certainly doesn't fit the stereotype.
You want to see his shoes?
So, a historian of huge breadth and vision, a whole range of cultural, political history, a whole range of countries, somebody who's become really a public intellectual on both sides of the Atlantic. He's done a whole series of very important programs on television, series on television. Most relevant at the moment is, of course, the story of the Jews, which I think came out in 2013, and Simon has now followed that story up in more detail in a historical trilogy of books, of which Volume 2, Belonging, has just appeared. I'm really here, I'm told I'm here to try and keep order and time, which is going to be impossible with this quartet. But I have some vague qualifications in that I have written a book called The Long Shadow about the history of the legacies of the First World War. And I've also doing at the moment a radio documentary for BBC Radio 4 about the Balfour Declaration and the war in Palestine in 1917, and that will be aired on the 5th of December, I think. So that's enough by way of introduction. Being a professor, I thought you should have the text on at your disposal, because this is a very short document. 67 words, I think, the actual declaration, one sentence, but a sentence that has been of enduring importance and, of course, enduring controversy in the Middle East and in the world today. And to try and talk a little bit about this is what we're going to do today, and we want to give time for questions from the audience as well. So to start off, Lord Rothschild, would you like to give us a few words on what you think, about the significance of the document and your take on it?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much. You asked me to talk about three things. First, a bit about the document and Weizmann, then a bit about our family and our involvement, and lastly, the whole question of the Balfour Declaration in Israel. And it's rather a formidable task with the panel you have, but here we go. I think you've all read this, have you? So I won't read it to you again, but as Weizmann said of the Balfour Declaration, miracles do happen, but one has to work very hard for them. And the first question we have to ask ourselves is how, against such overwhelming odds, such a miracle could have come about. Well, you have to think back before Weizmann to about 1900, when Herzl came to address the Zionist Congress. And he'd already written his Zionist Bible and was seen as a kind of modern Moses. And in his opening speech, he spoke, "England, great England, freedom-loving England, from here the idea of Zionism will soar higher and higher." But he died tragically, age 46, in 1904. And Zangwill wrote of him, not dead, because immortal, and went on to write his poem, which began, "Farewell, O Prince, farewell, O sorely tried, you dreamed a dream, and you paid the cost." Weizmann then took up the cause, and we ask ourselves, how could Weizmann, who came from a village in the plain of Russia, who spoke hardly any English, had no money, no particular reputation, living in Manchester, how could this guy penetrate the British establishment against vehement opposition from assimilationist Jews in England, for example, Edwin Montagu, who was serving in a cabinet which, however, saw the advantages of having world Jewry on Great Britain's side? Weizmann's efforts came at a grim moment in the Great World War, when the Turkish Empire was disintegrating. And one thing one shouldn't forget is contribution as a scientist, which was a very considerable one in the field of acetone and munitions to the war effort. But he was one of those rare individuals who changed the course of history. There are only a handful of them. He was a consummate diplomat, a man of tremendous charm and brilliance in forging relationships. I'll give you an example close to home for my family. He was introduced to my late cousin, Mrs. James de Rothschild, the daughter-in-law of Baron Idmore, who I'll come on to, when she was only 19. He wrote to her no less than 33 times between 1914 and 1916. And in that period, he organized no less than 2,000 personal interviews and wrote 1,000 letters. And the historian, Sir Charles Webster, went so far as to describe Weizmann's achievement as the greatest act of diplomatic statesmanship at a grimly undecided stage of the First World War. So that's a bit about Weizmann. Now, if you take our family's connection, and I won't dwell too long on that, it goes right back to the 1880s. Simon actually wrote a book about it, his first book. Goes right back to the 1880s, when from France, Baron Edmond de Rothschild, following the terrible Russian pogroms, gave his support to the pioneering activity of the early Zionists to establish communities and his industry in Israel. And his son, my late cousin Jimmy, he'd moved to England because of the Dreyfus case in part, and he and his wife, Dolly, carried on Edmond's philanthropy. Jimmy gave the Knesset building to the State of Israel, and his wife, Dorothy, offered the Supreme Court building. On the English Rothschilds' side, the first Lord Rothschild, Natty, was deeply concerned with a lot of the Jews in Russia. And Herzl had made many attempts to meet with him, and finally they met in, I think, July of 1902. But it's fair to say that he never fully embraced Herzl's ideas, although he warmed, I think you would agree with me, to the idea of a mandate for Great Britain over Palestine, with the Zionists having a home there. Natty died in 1915, and his son, Walter, who was the second Lord Rothschild, was an astonishingly eccentric individual. He was converted, however, surprisingly, by Weizmann to become a passionate Zionist at a time when his great interest was to create the finest private collection of natural history specimens ever made by one man. And he succeeded, indeed, in doing so at his museum, some of you may have seen, in Tring. He never married and would ride around the park in a zebra-drawn carriage on top of one of his 144 giant tortoises from the Galapagos. But he was serious. He published over 1,200 books and papers, together with colleagues, based on his collections, and had the distinction of being made a Fellow of the Royal Society. Then the sort of thing happened that he, through his sister-in-law, Rezika, a Hungarian lady who'd married my grandfather, he met Weizmann, and he became convinced that the future of the Jews lay in Zionism. And he was fairly soon perceived as the lay leader of the Jewish community, which is why the Declaration was addressed to him. Now, just a quick word on the present generation's commitment, which came about through two quite separate branches of the Rothschild family and devolved to me through inheritance of the title and through my cousin Dorothy Dolly entrusting me with the work of the family foundation Yad Hanadiv. We employ about 40 people in Jerusalem, supporting a wide range of activities, including education, technology, environmental issues, and facilitating employment for the Arab communities. And we're now, you didn't see it, I think, deeply engaged, it's a large hole, the building site, in the creation of Israel's new National Library in Jerusalem to serve the people of the book and indeed all faiths. Now, briefly, the third subject you asked me to talk briefly about, and the most difficult one, the importance of the Declaration to the State of Israel. Surely one can start off by saying it was the foundation stone of the state. And you said in your excellent book, The Long Shadow, The Great War in the 20th Century, that the Declaration itself was two-sided. It was a moral commitment, but an ambiguous one, to Jews and Arabs. It had no legal standing. The public act of recognition to Zionism was to be formalized after Churchill presented to Parliament the Churchill White Paper in 1922, which was emphatic in its support of Zionism. That paper was submitted to the League of Nations in Geneva and approved. And as Weizmann put it, it represented the Magna Carta of liberation, a decisive event in Jewish history. And it gave Zionism the legal right to move towards statehood. And that in turn led to the establishment of the State of Israel following the United Nations resolution of 1947. So after 2,000 years of persecution, the Jews were at last to return home. And as the poet touchingly, Robert Frost, wrote in The Death of the Hired Man, home is the place where, when you go there, they have to take you in. And every Jew in the world has the right of return to live in Israel. The greatest prize, of course, of all remains the one of peace. And the problem is that with Israel sandwiched between Hezbollah in the north and Hamas in the south, both fed by Iran, both hell-bent on destroying Israel, the barrier to peace remains, together with the fear that at any time an aggressive coalition of countries could launch a war of annihilation. Now, it's fair to say that in spite of these threats and wars over the 100 years since the Declaration, which we're marking, the Jews have created a country which has made unimaginable progress. The story is surely one of the most extraordinary in the history of mankind. No doubt many of you will have questions about the Declaration, which set out to establish a society which would ensure the civil and religious rights of its non-Jewish residents. An enormous amount remains to be done, but I'd still like to end these few remarks by saying that I'm a strong believer in Zionism, the Declaration, and the State of Israel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Lord Rothschild. Simon Sebag, Montefiore?
I'm just going to say a couple of things, because that's what I've been told I'm allowed to make. 2 points. Lord Rothschild got 3 points. But what I wanted to say was, it was, as Jacob suggested, a miracle when this when the Balfour Declaration was handed down, and it was not for nothing that when Sir Mark Sykes came out of the Cabinet Office with the news that the Balfour Declaration was to be given, that he called out to Professor Weitzman, who was sitting outside, "It's a boy, Dr. Weitzman, it's a boy." And so there was this sense of an amazing birth in every sense. But it's often claimed, and Jacob has emphasized the achievement of Theodor Herzl, it's often claimed that Zionism was invented in 1896 with Herzl's famous book, the Judenstaat, the Jewish State. And that was certainly the beginning of the movement, the modern political movement. And part of Herzl's genius was that of organizer, networker, promoter, projector, all of these things which sound very modern. And he was really the first modern figure who embraced this idea. But the ideal of Zionism is such an ancient one that long before the name existed, it's important to understand that the idea of Zionism, of the return to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, really began on that day in 70 AD, when Titus Caesar stormed the temple, stormed Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, burnt Jerusalem, massacred everybody within it, and expelled the Jews. For a long time after that, Jews were allowed to exist in Judea and Samaria, the provinces of the Roman Empire, but not in Jerusalem itself.
And Galilee too.
And Galilee too. And of course they also lived all over the Roman Empire, in Cyprus, in Rome itself, in Italy, in North Africa, and there are other Jewish communities in what had been Babylon. Now, in 132, Simon Bar Kokhba launched another massive rebellion against Emperor Hadrian. And when Hadrian put down that rebellion, he massacred and annihilated or exiled much of the Jewish community that was still in what is now the Holy Land. And he changed the name of Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina. He changed the name of Judea to Palestina after the ancient biblical enemy of the Jews, the Philistines. And from then on, it was known as Palestine. But whatever its name is, the Jews of the world, many of them now in the diaspora, longed for that temple. And under the Byzantine emperors, when they converted to Christianity, they were again banned strictly from the temple. They could pray around the walls. When the Persians took Jerusalem in 612, 614, the Jews, for the last time before modern times, were given Jerusalem and the temple to run, and they did that for 2 or 3 years before it was reconquered by Heraclius. They returned to Jerusalem with the Muslims in 638. And there they remained until the Crusades, when they were all massacred in 1099. Again, when the Muslims retook the city in 1187, Jews again lived in Jerusalem and were allowed to pray around the walls, around the temple. The rest of the Jewish population, the mass of them, were spread around Europe, and they continued to long, if they could afford it, to return to Jerusalem. Great traumas were suffered by the Jewish people: the expulsion from Spain, the expulsion from England, the move to the Ottoman Empire, and so on. And fortunately for the Jews, in the 17th century, a Hebraist sense arose among the Protestants, who believed that in order to fulfill ancient biblical prophecies, the Jewish return was essential for the second coming of Christ. And in some ways, the secular leaders like Churchill, Balfour, Lloyd George, who delivered the Balfour Declaration, were the successors of these people. They were succeeded by the evangelical, muscular, imperial Christians of Victorian times, Lord Shaftesbury, people like that. And their heirs were Balfour, Lloyd George, and Churchill, Philo-Semitic statesmen brought up on the Bible, the St. James edition, of course, and who had great sympathy for the idea of a Jewish return of what became Zionism. The biggest helpers for the Zionist cause, apart from those cabinet ministers, were, of course, the Romanov Tsars of Russia, whose vicious anti-Semitism and growing anti-Semitism converted millions of Jews to the idea of returning to Zion. And so their help was an ironical one. So that's my first point. The second one, which I'll make more quickly, is that the Balfour Declaration, I believe, is the result of many things: of a just cause, a just longing for a return, the rights of Jews, like any other people, to have a home. But it was also a result of perfect timing. It happened in 1917, as Jacob touched on. 1917, the war on the Western Front was disastrous. It seemed like it would never end. Vast bloodshed and stalemate in the trenches. Fortunately, America had just entered the war. Russia had overthrown its Tsar, but was just holding on in the war, barely, scarcely, facing enormous routs on the Eastern Front. It was believed, and it was believed that the Jews of those two countries held almost mystical power over world affairs. And they were vast communities. There were 6 million, or going up to several million in America. There were 6 million in Russia. And it was believed that they would be important. The British government was pursuing all sorts of other avenues to try and defeat the Central Powers. They were negotiating with the Arab family, the Hashemite family of Hussein, Sheriff of Mecca. They were also dividing up the Ottoman Empire in discussions with Britain, with France and Russia. So all of these things were happening. And I believe that just as the promises to the Sheriff Hussein of Mecca could only have happened in 1917, so the Jews were lucky that the miracle of Balfour was in many ways the result of the unique situation in 1917. So a combination of vast and long historical longings with a just longing for home, and a combination of perfect political and military timing created the environment for the giving of the Balfour Declaration.
Thank you. Howard?
Jacob was allowed 3 comments, and Simon was allowed 2 comments, and I'm allowed 1 comment. And I actually think that's too many. I haven't got the right to a comment in this company. I mean, this is astonishing authority on this subject. It's hard to imagine being in a room and having people who know more about this subject or who should be listened to more. I have no right to be listened to on this subject. I speak only as an ordinary angry Jew. And my anger is rooted in, well, it's rooted in many things. But in this context, it's about why it is that Zionism has become the dirty word it is, and why do we allow it to go on being used in that particular way. So I have got nothing to say about the Balfour Declaration, except that I am pleased there was such a thing, and I am interested in the before and the after. The before, as one learns about it from both Simon's terrific books, the book on Jerusalem and Simon's new book on belonging, both fantastic. Fascinating stories about what leads to the Balfour Declaration, what was going on in the world of Jewry before the Balfour Declaration. Very few historical events are just of that moment. This is a particularly complex one. What we're going to discover in the next few weeks is lots of people lamenting the Balfour more than lamenting the Balfour Declaration as a terrible moment, as though dropped from the sky, as though, wished upon innocent people by guilty people, as though it came from nowhere. And what all three historians will show you is that this was an act long in the brewing. And it's terribly important that we understand that. Once you know how long it was in the brewing, you cannot go on using that word Zionist to mean the kind of things it's been made to mean. I'm also very interested, I don't know whether this has any bearing on some of the stuff that one reads about and this is quite late in the piece, in 19th century, both 19th century Russian and 19th century English literature, about the condition of Jews and the way in which, for many, a return to Israel wasn't just a place of safety, a place of refuge from danger, and the danger was immense, but also was an opportunity seen by many critics and novelists at the time to rescue Jews from themselves. That there was a feeling that the Jews had become introverted, that Jews in those little shtetls of Eastern Europe who were praying all day and believing that they were the chosen people, and the irony of them believing that they were the chosen people and they were living in this terrible poverty, and also their minds had shrunk to just the daily repetition of ritual. It was hoped. There's a very good essay by Isaiah Berlin, I can't remember its title, you'll know it, where he talks about that behind Zionism there was this belief that the Jews could be rescued from, intellectually and spiritually, from this narrow round of repetitive ritual. And one shouldn't forget that Zionism also means that. And when some of us regret some of the things that have happened to Zionism, it's not only some of the political consequences, but I regret. I'm an angry Jew, but I'm very much an angry secular Jew. And my understanding of the great idealism behind Israel was that it should be a place of refuge for all Jews, religious and non-religious, but it certainly should not have been not a place dominated by religiousness. Whenever I see religiousness dominating things in Israel, I regret what happened to the secular dream. This was a place where people would write poetry and be intellectually free from the chains of their own making. One should never forget that people enchain themselves as well as anything else. So I'm a before and I'm an after. And as far as the after is concerned, what do we do? I say, this is almost, if I knew how to make a rallying call, I would make it. But what on earth is one to do with the whole way in which Zionism is talked about now? If the Labour Party ends up I don't want to turn this into local politics, but if the Labour Party gets in, we're going to get a lot more of this. We're going to get a lot more of the evils of Zionism. And somehow or other, a dialogue, a debate has to be started that refutes that. This is not what you say. You cannot go on saying we're not anti-Semites, we're just anti-Zionists, without realizing that in the end, if you are an anti-Zionist, you are anti the aspiration, an ancient aspiration of the Jews. You are anti a liberation movement of you are anti something that the Jews desperately needed, and therefore you can't go on saying I'm anti-Zionist, but I also love the Jews. That's my best on the subject.
Well done.
Simon.
Well, on this running down, I get naught comments, really.
Well, we'll open up for question and
answer. Not something I'm used to.
Oh, sorry, you're still talking.
Yeah. So actually it liberates me to make like 12, I think. Yeah, to Howard's last important point, about Israel really being founded, as David Ben-Gurion thought about it, as a place for all Jews, in which religious Jews would have a place but not be necessarily the dominant force. As has been pointed out by Shlomo Avineri and others, including me, Herzl's understanding of the title of his book, the Judenstaat, was not the Jewish state, it was the state of the Jews. That's not the same thing. And that particular argument about what that semantic slide means goes on with tremendous ferocity, as you all know. I would just say I'm going to be in a position to which I'm not at all accustomed, the kind of Arab on this panel in just a minute. But I want to preface it by saying it's very important to understand, actually, as both Simon Sebag, Montefiore and Howard said, the particular moment. By 1917, at least 600,000 Jews have been deported in the Russian Empire alone, partly as a result of pogroms, partly as a result of the movement of the army. Those Jews were homeless. One of the most important words in this entire document is home. And whether home necessarily implied the inevitability of statehood, as Jacob rather implied was the case, is again rather a moot point. But home and homeland, it definitely did. Very important too, I've been going around saying this. I was very struck when I was working on belonging, that if you came into a Russian city like Kiev or Lizvetgrad or Chisinau that had just experienced a pogrom, the first thing you'd see were feathers, enormous kind of blizzard of feathers. And the reason for that is that before they actually beat up and try to murder Jews and assault small children, the stabbing was at bolsters, and that's one of the few scenes in Fiddler on the Roof which is accurate. Furniture was smashed up. The idea was to say, you will never have a home. You will never have a home. Your home is provisional. And so the message was received loud and clear, and something else happened, which is almost missing from all histories, the Balfour Declaration, and of the moment. It's thought that between 150 and 200,000 Jews were killed between 1914 and 1970, not just talking about deportations. Why? Because they were treated as spies in the area, particularly the Ukraine and Poland, occupied by the Russian armies, and because Yiddish sounded like German. It was thought if a Jew was rich enough to have a telephone, he was communicating with the enemy. And the answer to that was first to uproot Jews, and then if they took a little time in going, wading knee-deep in those feathers, they were killed. And if you wanted to make the case, actually, that there would never... one other point, rather important, in this mix of making a case for Zionism as a matter of imperative urgency, a blood libel case that happened in 1913, the so-called Baylis case, in which it was argued, yet again, that Jews needed to slit the throats of Christian children in order to bake Passover matzot. So these horrors, which were thought to have been evaporated with the inexorable march of modernity, not only have not evaporated, but as pretty much all the speakers have said, were growing worse. Now, on to my role as an Arab here. The issue, it's often said that, the quote is often made that Zionism always thought it was for people without a land moving into a land without a people. But no Zionist ever said that. It was said actually by an evangelical missionary, American, early in the 19th century. The notion that Zionists never paid any attention to the incredibly intractable problem that they were outnumbered in Palestine at the turn of the century. They're not in Jerusalem. Jerusalem had long had a large Jewish majority, in fact. But they are outnumbered by 6 to 7 to 1. It's not true. They thought about it a lot. And the one who thought about it most intensely and most eloquently was Ahad Ha'am, initially an agent for the Vysotsky Tea Company in London, but a great journalist in Hebrew, great poet, great writer, and he worried incessantly about this. He was hostile to Herzl precisely because he thought there should be an organic Hebrew-speaking Jewish settlement, therefore a home, yes, not necessarily a state. And the issue, the intense issue, which will indeed be canvassed over the next few weeks, is whether or not it was possible to promote Arab nationalism and Jewish nationalism, an Arab home and a Jewish home side by side. It's a complicated, very specific issue of where the borders of the Arab state promised by McMahon and by the war government to Sharif Hussein of Mecca and his two sons Faisal and Abdullah, where those borders were and whether they included Palestine or not. The French certainly believed they did not. And you think, well, with this dark hindsight we have, it was always going to be a monstrous case of collision between two intractable desires. And if you take the Zionist view, I too, unrepentant Zionist, there is a very large place for the realization of Arab nationalism all through the world. And on the other hand, we have those 150,000 Jews slaughtered. Why should the Arab population have to deal with the sins of the Europeans? The answer lies, and it shouldn't be treated as a penalty, in what's been said before, that the continuous connection, the intense connection, not just all those times that Simon Sebag, Montefiore just spoke eloquently about, but Jews coming back to creating modern Tiberias, Kabbalism being created in the 16th century, it never ever went away. That's why it could not be in Uganda, it could not be in El Arish. But could this thing actually be brought together? And this was actually broached in an agreement made between Faisal and Weizmann in January 1919, Declaration of Principles. Later, Faisal would actually in a letter welcome the Jews back to their ancient land. But still, that might have been a matter of manipulation. Could it happen? Remember, Weizmann is a scientist. And his notion, which we may now see as ingenuous, Vladimir Jabotinsky always said, you can't buy Arab anger off with irrigation, words to that effect. But Weizmann thought it would be possible for there to be a shared place in the Middle East, which would, in a sense, through science, through economic investment, through modernization, with the possibility of a secular world in the Middle East, with places for religion in which all boats would rise together. Now, it does sound, in retrospect, like a kind of wild fantasy, and yet I'm here to tell you that one of the few tiny grains of hope in the Middle East is where the two colliding narratives agree to park their mutually irreconcilable passions. I have a little bit to do with a wonderful organization, it's tiny, but it is heroic, called EcoPeace, which has offices in Ramallah, in Amman, and in Tel Aviv. And it's to do with the water situation in Palestine and including Gaza, which in many ways is catastrophic. And it has to be a collaboration. The fate of this particular ecological system demands actually parking the bloody history of these intractable narratives and just getting on with it in the sort of spirit which Weizmann actually anticipated. It may never prevail. We are learning in our own time that the kind of visceral creation of estrangement has purchase in politics, fatal, toxic, poisonous purchase, not just in the Middle East, from Myanmar to the Arizona. And that's what we're coping with now. So it is very important as the discussion of this moment goes ahead that we bear all these things in mind.
Thank you. Thank you, Simon. Thank you very much. A reminder, if you like, that water is thicker than blood in some ways. Before we open up, we have a few moments. I would just like, because this panel is in a sense weighted in one side, and I'm so glad Simon has made his, as it were, two-faced presentation, you know. What reactions do you have, the rest of the panel, to this question, you know, where is the Zionist project today with regard to those few lines which are inserted at the insistence of Lord Curzon, former Viceroy of India, about the rights of the non-Jewish communities? I mean, that is the intractable issue. Simon has talked eloquently about it. Do you have any comments about that and where it relates to Zionism today? I think I may be speaking. I may be speaking for other of us on this panel when I say that, you know, much of what has happened recently
while we celebrate the creation of the State of Israel, and I celebrate it every day, equally much of what is happening there now, I don't support, and I am disappointed by, and I'm not completely satisfied with the state, the ideal vision of the state that we believed was coming into creation, that Ben Gurion talked about. There are many things about the present government, for example, that I'm certainly not a great fan of, and I don't know how the rest of you feel about that. But I mean, but of course, I mean, I personally am a believer in the old plan of a sort of two-state solution, which still seems to me the only way that both peoples will get full freedom to have their own states. And that may be becoming an old-fashioned view. I don't know what all the rest of you think.
Well, Rothschild, do you have a...
It's an incredibly difficult moment, isn't it? Because I'm sure not many in this audience would wholeheartedly approve of what's going on in Israel. But you have had progress in certain areas. I mean, you mentioned water, Simon. It's a very, very big development in the last couple of months, when the Jordanians, the Palestinians and the Israelis agreed on a vast water project. The problem, I think, is this, isn't it? That you've got Hezbollah in the north of Israel, and they've got 150,000 missiles buried underground, and they're heavily supported by Iran. And then in the south you have Hamas, and Hamas, was announced yesterday, is coming together with the PLO. Now, what does that mean for Israel? I mean, Hamas and Hezbollah are hell-bent, as I said, on the destruction of Israel. So, in that kind of situation, you can understand, I think, why Israel is so right-wing, that it has to defend itself. As we know, it's a tiny country. A notch, I can't say Wales, but it is. And therefore, it's just one of those very awkward times in history which will have to unravel, I'm afraid, over a period of many years before things get better. Of course, in an ideal world, a two-state solution would be a good thing. But if we import into the Palestinian territories Hamas on the one side and Hezbollah on the other, it's too big a price to expect the Israelis, too big a risk for the Israelis to face up to today.
Howard, do you want to add anything before we open up to questions?
Not really. I was just thinking of how Amos Oz, I go to the writers, really.
Yes.
I'm sentimental about the Israeli writers. I think they'll probably know. Amos Oz used to say the tragedy of that part of the world was that two people had equal rights. Two people were equally in the rights. He's got much more gloomy recently and said the tragedy of this part of the world is that two people are equally wrong.
Yes.
And that's upsetting. But one does have to wonder, while agreeing with what's just been said, does it help the cause that the liberal West is unable to be even-handed in its dealing with, in its thinking about Israel? I remember Yehoshua being on television a year or two ago saying, I'm not going to say I want the West to stay out of this. I want the West to interfere as much as it can. I just want it to interfere even-handedly. And would it not be the case that if we were more even-handed, we would not create impossible expections in the minds and hearts of the Palestinians?
Let's open up now. I'll save you. No, come on. We need to give the audience time. You can come back. Can you keep your questions to questions rather than statements? I'll take maybe one or two questions and then feed them to the panel, and I'll start with Simon so he can get in whatever he wants. Mike, roving Mike, can you wait and put your hand up, and then we will get the roving Mike to come to you. My goodness, you silenced? Good. A couple of hands there in the middle.
First of all, absolutely outstanding. Thank you very much. My question is about the decision of the US yesterday to pull out of UNESCO from next year. I wondered what your thoughts were on that. I mean, despite your scepticism about Trumpian isolationism, was it not justified for the US to do that, given that UNESCO has denied so often that historical connection between the Jews and the Holy Land?
Fine. And I think somebody next to you.
Could you please contextualise a bit more? Simon Sebag, Montefiore, touched upon it, about collapse of empire, growth of nationalism, and why the idea of Zionism was so unique in an era of multiple expressions of national identity and aspirations, such that India, Pakistan, and same of Israel's creation, about 2 million deaths there, yet all the attention seems to carry on being on Balfour Declaration and Israel in this year.
Fine. Those are two very good questions. Let's take some answers to those first of all. So first of all, the question of the decision about UNESCO, and then this larger question about Zionism, if you like, as a form of nationalism, which is so vigorous at the end of the First World War.
You should answer that.
No, I mean, I'm...
Go on.
Well, okay, why don't you start?
Do you want to?
Oh no, well, no, not really. I mean, I do have views, but they're very terse. I think you're.
Well, I think on the UNESCO question, this is like probably the only thing that Donald Trump's done that I wholeheartedly agree with. I mean, UNESCO has been notorious for 40 years as a completely biased organisation of frankly amoral views. Propagated by dictatorial, brutal regimes which were obsessed with anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism, and which were deeply unfair to the Israeli narrative. One of the key things, one of the reasons I think probably all of us write our books in different ways, is to tell people the narratives of people, the stories that exist. And the only way peace will ever come to the Middle East is not just with two people with equality sharing a land, but also recognizing each other's narratives, each other's stories with truth. Now, when I was researching Jerusalem, for example, I'm sure you've had the same experience, and I remember talking to Palestinian archaeologists who had just announced that there was never a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And so when I met them, I was slightly nervous. I said, I'm kind of looking into the Jewish temple in Jerusalem.
What Jewish
and they
temple?
said, who they had just announced with Arafat and all sorts of the people, you know, with the PLO agreement with Abu Mazen, that there would never been a Jewish temple there. As soon as I was on my own with them, I said, "What about the?" They said, "Of course, I can show you all the stones. Let me take you down there. Let me show you Herod, and this is the origin." I said, "But you just said there wasn't one." And they said, "Yeah, but we can't say it in public, but we all know it was so." And this is just a small demonstration of the challenge. Now, UNESCO has been the worst culprit in doing this, so absolutely it should be unfunded. It should be closed down. The absurd things they've said about Hebron, about Jerusalem itself, have been crimes against history and acts that will do nothing to ever bring peace to the Middle East. So that's one point. On empires, there's a great myth on empires and nationalism. There's a great myth that the Ottoman Empire was this kind of wonderland of religious and administrative efficiency, religious freedom, gentleness, tolerance, cosmopolitanism. None of these things were really true. In the 16th centuries, in the time of Suleiman the Magnificent and his son Selim the Sot, there had been great tolerance of Jews. They'd welcomed many Jews, for example, from the deportations and the expulsions in the West. Joseph Nazi, who was one of our great heroes, had actually found, who was sort of known as the Great Jew, was one of the most powerful men in Europe, close advisor to the Ottoman sultans, had actually founded a small Jewish homeland around Tiberias. Yeah. And it was just one example of many about how the idea of Jewish return goes right the way through these 2,000 years. But after that, the Ottoman Empire had become a chaotic, shambolic, impoverishing organization. They'd ruined much of the Arab world. They'd impoverished it. A situation the Arab world has still not really recovered from, not to speak of Jerusalem, which was half empty, a wasteland, Palestine, which was extremely poor. And so the myth that the breaking up of this empire was a tragedy in itself is preposterous. But no one quite knew what to do with this vast territory. And no one's had much idea. Arab political leaders haven't shown much more idea of how to rule these countries since either, nor was international diplomacy. And so And so it's a great question, the relationship between nationalism and empires. Perhaps I should hand over to someone else before I go on any longer, but do you want him?
I was going to say, I mean, I think your question is a very apt one, and of course, if you put this in a larger context, this is why George Kennan, the American diplomat and historian, called the Great War the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century, because so much was broken, so much was opened up, and so much was on the table in 1919. Now, you're talking about Weizmann and Faisal and so on, but at the Paris Peace Conference, you have Kurds who want a state of their own, Ukrainians who want a state of their own. If you take the case of Thomas Masaryk, I mean, this is the gestation of the Czechoslovak state, something that carries on up to the 1990s and finally breaks up in after the Cold War is over. And there are certain ways in which it is interesting to think about Zionism and the Zionist project within that moment of the breaking of empires and the creating of nations. Let's take another round of questions. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
So thank you. That was an exceptionally interesting series of talks. So I'm a teacher in secondary school. Part of what I'm teaching at the moment is an unassessed, there's no exam, series of lessons about the Holocaust. I'm also a part-time student at the University of Oxford in education.
Okay, and your question?
My question is, in light of the UCL Holocaust Education Research Project, the new National Memorial for the Holocaust, how do we think that the best way to teach young people about the Holocaust, to dispel these theories or these ideas of anti-Zionism, which are exceptionally popular in young people? So really just a general question about education.
How we should teach the Holocaust to young people. Another question? Okay, I can't see very well, I've got the light in my eyes, but that's fine.
Hello. Yes, hi. I found it quite interesting, the point that was made about what Zionism means today, as opposed to what it meant before the Balfour Declaration. So I'd like to get some views from the panel about what was Zionism before, and what does it mean today? I mean, does it mean, what are the reasons that it has some negative connotations? And can that be shifted in some way? So it'd be good to get some ideas on how the word Zionism could mean something closer to what it meant before the Declaration, about having a homeland, having free speech, and a place in which we can express ourselves for people who are not necessarily always of one religion, but generic. I mean, my father is originally Palestinian. He was born in Haifa, and we became refugees, and it would be, and we don't have the right to return to this country. So it would be interesting to have that view from the panel of how it could be a place for everybody.
Thank you very much. And I've got one more question. We'll take that, and then oh yes, somebody at the right at the back.
Yes, I'm wondering if somebody on the panel can also comment on the rise of anti-Semitism in the U.S. post-Trump.
Right, okay.
Well, we have 7 minutes here.
Right, okay, yes, well, we're in the red zone now, definitely.
Orange,
yes, right, okay. So, teaching the Holocaust, Zionism today in its meaning and its capaciousness for all the peoples, and anti-Semitism in the US.
Can I try a quickie?
Yeah, go.
Really well. Well, I think actually the first thing you need to say, because this is not self-evident, it is very simple, is that that anti-Semitism was not caused by Zionism, but the opposite way around, that Zionism was caused by anti-Semitism. The Holocaust is often taught as though it began in 1933, or began with the rise of Hitler, or some moment in Vienna. What we were all saying in our different ways was that this is a relentless, unending, self-modernizing, racializing curse which affected, the Jews are not the only people to have been uprooted, to have been displaced, but the only people who have been essentially burdened with the guilt of having killed the Saviour and having going on slaughtering others for their own peculiar. So in some sense, there are millennia of peculiarly intense hatred which did not work out for the best as modernity went on. So it has to be a kind of long history. On the point about what Zionism now, I did want to come back and be very quick about this, because actually I think 1967, which were also the results of 1967 are a huge shift.
You mean the June War?
I do, because afterwards, actually, what happened to Zionism was essentially it's being overtaken by an extraordinary kind of Judaic religious fundamentalism. And I absolutely agree with Jacob's point about, Hamas on one side and Hezbollah on the other. So in some sense, being, vigilant is important, but that has absolutely nothing to do with settlements. What's happened in the settlement movement is actually a messianic, fundamentalist, Judaic push, which has not helped that original broader idea of Zionism. I'll stop there.
It's actually inimical to
It's inimical.
There's the irony of it. They say they're doing it in the name of Zionism.
At one point, the Labour Party said the Netanyahu government, certainly Avigdor Lieberman and Israel Beitenu, was an anti-Zionist movement. I absolutely agree with that.
Anybody else would like to come in on those questions?
I mean,
Teaching of the Holocaust?
think, Simon, on the question of settlements, the only defense of settlements surely is that for security reasons you have to populate that area with intelligent and good people. Now, the problem is that it hasn't led to a population of that kind.
You said you have to populate. You mean for defense purposes? No, you don't. Israel has an extraordinary defense, incredible defense apparatus in terms of the Middle East. Having 7 people waving an Israeli flag right 10 miles from Jenin does not help defend the Israeli state, Jacob. That's nothing to do with it, in my view.
Yeah, no, I think it could do and should do if we're going to have these settlements.
Well, I would
it has an incredible defence, but if you take Iron Dome, for example, it can't cope with 150,000 missiles.
A yeshiva 10 miles from Jenin is not going to help much either.
Look, I think, as I said, the population of those settlements, I think, is highly problematic, if I can put it politely.
So, would anybody like to come and answer the question about the teaching of the Holocaust?
Well, they should all read If This Is a Man.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So you go from Simon's suggestion that we go right back to the beginning. So the Gospel of John, followed by If This Is a Man. Yes. And then a good teacher will fill in the 2,000 years in between.
So that's your job, right? Yes. Any other contributions on that?
Well, just a very brief one. I mean, you have got an extraordinary phenomenon of the British government supporting a Holocaust museum right next door to the House of Parliament. So there's an acute awareness of the need to continue to educate people. If you take the library project, which Hannah and I are so involved with, it's the first time, really, because of the revolution that's going on, that you've been able to link up Jewish communities throughout the world and, in fact, to educate them. Now, of course, one doesn't only want to educate them, one wants to educate others, but that facility exists in a way that it hadn't existed before.
I think one thing that's worth just saying about the Holocaust question, your question, is I think the key thing to understand about it, and I think is that the sheer uniqueness of the Jewish experience in the middle of the 20th century, the sheer uniqueness of a modern, sophisticated state, Germany, aided by many minions across the civilized parts of Western and Central Europe, who set about for racial purposes and with openness of intent, if not of the actual machinations of it, who set about the industrial slaughter of an entire people to rid an entire continent and the world of one people who were entirely innocent. And I think that the amazing thing that they managed to achieve, the destruction of around 6 million of those people. I think that the thing you could teach, and perhaps, is probably one of the most extraordinary events of the 20th century in the entire human experience. that unique experience, and anything that I think diminishes the uniqueness, the specialness of it. And this is not, by the way, a specialness that whining Jews are longing to claim. We'd much prefer to claim other great achievements than being the victims in the Holocaust. But I think that, if anything you take away to teach, and if any of you take away something to understand about the Holocaust, I believe that is it.
If I could just add something there, that I'm on the advisory committee of the Imperial War Museum's new World War II galleries. They've done the World War I, they're doing the World War II galleries. And we have had a lot of discussion about how those galleries, World War II, should relate to the Holocaust galleries. And questions about, can you absorb the Holocaust within World War II? You can't, for those reasons, as Simon said. I mean, what distinguishes the challenge, the nationalist project for the Jews as it developed over the 20th century, is that unlike other national groups, many of them persecuted, the Jews are in a unique position where their whole existence was in question in 1941-42. And so we have made it very clear, or the discussion within the gallery is very clear, that the new Holocaust galleries will actually have a link through at certain points to the World War II galleries, because clearly Endlösung, the final solution, could not have happened without that, if you like, baleful opportunity in 1941. You were talking about the opportunities in 1917 of a different nature. But you have to leave the Holocaust to stand as a separate entity because of that historical distinctiveness, that historical enormity in the proper sense of that word, enormity. We are now at -1, so we have to stop. May I make two announcements? Before I ask you to give our panelists a round of thanks, would you please stay in your seats until the panel have left and gone over to the book signing area outside and to the left, because otherwise they won't have a chance to escape. If you wish to harangue them, attack them, embrace them, do it over in the book tent rather than here. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking everybody for